Donald Trump promised to stop Muslims and protect Christianity. He essentially had unlimited confidence and loyalty of his evangelical followers, even when the Access Hollywood tapes were released, in which he was bragging about how he would get away with grabbing women by their genitalia. How did we get here? Kristin Kobes Du Mez's book, Jesus and John Wayne, is an attempt to explain that. This is a conversation that needs to be had. Mystic pirate Kootenaygirl joins me to discuss this book after this.
I'm Bridge Livwad, and you're listening to The Wax Museum. Conversations that need to be had.
Hello, Marie. Welcome back to the Wax Museum.
How are you, John?
Good. It's been like 2 weeks in a row. Woo!
I know. It's awesome.
We're going to be spending lots of time together now because we've got a whole book to go through. We're doing Kristin Kobes Du Mez, Jesus and John Wayne. A groundbreaking book, mind-blowing book, lots for us to go through. Did much of the book surprise you, Marie?
There were parts that sort of surprised me in the way that it kind of just brought it all together. Like it wasn't surprising, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. But it's just how she brought it all together. And it just, all the light bulbs went off and it all made sense.
Yeah, I think the thing that shocked me the most is Billy Graham, because I think, like, you know, we're kind of raised with this idea that Billy Graham is like Mother Teresa, where it's like, you know, oh, for sure, that person's in heaven. They never did any wrong. And so we will get to Billy Graham. So that's just a little teaser for y'all. So basically, in the beginning, you know, we saw in the U.S. that Christians started making decisions to choose the lesser of two evils. But then they developed this deep affection for Trump. People's discourse became more warlike, and all Christians wanted was to stop abortion and fight for religious liberty. It was a militant masculinity, and the end justified the means. And here's the kicker. Du Mez says that evangelicals did not vote for Trump despite their beliefs. They voted for him because of their beliefs. This notion shocked me. And that was kind of the beginning of the book. Was that shocking to you when she said that?
No, not really. Not really. Yeah, only because over the last 2 years, part of my deconstruction has been how many Christians love Trump. And I was seeing that, oh, this is actually a part of your belief, a guy like this coming out on top. So it wasn't that surprising to me.
Yeah, and I guess for me, it was like initially I kind of saw this whole thing with Trump where it's like, this guy is ridiculous. And I felt like everybody was on board with it. Like, it was almost like, it was like William Hung, you know, like it was kind of like, does this guy know he's like, is he even in on this joke that like nobody thinks he should be president? And then it was like, seriously, I think a week before the election that everybody turned. And I'm like, I'm talking in Canada, like people that have nothing to do with this were like, you know what? All this stuff that we thought about how ridiculous this guy was, it was just the media. I don't know what it was. It was like a magic trick. It was crazy.
Yeah, well, it was kind of like as if he was the underdog, right? And like people like rooting for the underdog, but like I have friends who own businesses and they loved him because he was a businessman, and like they like felt like he understood them. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Like, and these are like strong Christian people who in the beginning really loved Trump.
Yeah. Well, and that in itself too is an interesting, like the kind of pro-business Christian. And I understand. I'm not saying Christians should own businesses, but it's
No,
like
yeah.
it's interesting to me because I made this post on Facebook that was talking about if a monkey was hoarding bananas, a
I saw
scientist
that
would
one.
be like, why is he hoarding all of them? But if it's like with a human, we put that person on the cover of Forbes magazine. And it was
Yep.
interesting because like I had a friend from like northern BC, which I think a lot of those people are pretty redneck in northern British Columbia.
Yep.
And so when she posted it, after I got all the reaction I got on mine, because it was just all these people like just like angry, because it's like, well, that those people create jobs, and the monkey, he's not giving bananas, and he's not or whatever. And then one person is like, well, maybe they should look into why there are monkeys that aren't even trying to get bananas. And I'm like, what?
I saw that. Yeah.
And
Like,
I'm just
what?
like, I mean, yeah, I guess, but I'm like, particularly within Christianity, it blows my mind that people want to blame victims in every situation. And it's just so messed up. But anyways, I guess like, so this idea that the Christians chose him because of who he was instead of in spite of who he was. Now, when I think about it, it's like, well, this should have been obvious to me when I consider Bush's preemptive war, and conservative Christians' take in the United States on the death penalty, and the vehement like the defense of guns, and just how strict people are about that. It's not surprising that this is the most likely demographic to be anti-immigrant, most of them seeing Islam as violent. Now, looking on my days as a conservative, I do remember being somewhat supportive of preemptive war. I mean, 9/11, that was crazy. We knew there were terrorists that didn't engage in conflict with the same rules of engagement as us, as these ethical soldiers on our side did. For that reason, I wasn't entirely against torture either. I'm actually really glad we didn't have social media then. I would probably have had some really bad tweets.
Same here.
So where were you at with the same things at this time in history? Like kind of the Bush era, like post 9/11 kind of.
So we were very conservative then, like just like you're saying. Very like pro, like not pro war, but like pro justified war.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, like we watched the towers fall in real time, and we have a lot of family in New York.
Yeah.
And you feel that visceral, like, what the hell? And you want some sort of justice, but like we don't, like, justice is something that we don't ever really get.
No.
Like in this world, we don't ever really get it. It's a standard that we set, that we want to achieve and strive for, but we don't really ever get it. And so from the human perspective, that visceral, like I want revenge, you know, because we identify these are our people and they got hurt. But there was a part of me that did start to question then, like, okay, well, why are they focusing on America so much? Like, what's going on? And I did start to look at then, like, some of the ways that, like, North Americans pillage other countries, and basically how they use other people to stand on their backs to better themselves.
Yeah, and I think for that, like for me at that point in history, I think that's when I started really getting into like Relevant magazine, and Relevant magazine started to shift my view on things because they were very pro-justice, like very pro-social justice. and looking at that from a biblical perspective. And so I started to like look at that and say, well, maybe the culture wars aren't worth fighting. And I think that's really what changed it for me. And then, I had a family member that was like, a New Democrat kind of person. And so kind of said, well, I think the New Democrat Party is more in line with the teachings of Jesus. And I'm like, what? And I think that really shifted it too. And I honestly, I don't remember everything being so intensely political until 2016. Like I feel like the Bush era, it was like everybody made fun of Bush, and it was like, oh yeah, he makes, he says nuclear instead of nuclear, right? Like it was just like things like that. And I mean, it's funny looking back to just how intense that era was.
Yeah.
Because he seems mild, but in all honesty, there was a lot of people that died under him, and it's, Trump, it's like, well, he didn't really start any new wars, which I'm like, well, that's a plus, but like, man, just the rising kind of anger in discourse, while he was in power was so bad. It's like, it was so hard to watch what he did to our faith. Like I just and I think that's where a lot of people lost their faith. Yeah. And that's the worst part of it, right? And it's like, is this culture war really worth it? Because there's a whole generation that we're going to lose in the culture war because they feel like we hate them.
Right.
So that's always been my fear with that. So one of the things Du Mez says is that, I guess this study shows that Christians are more confident in their religious leaders than other faiths.
That's interesting, isn't it?
I know. And I'm like, I wonder why that is. Like, why would that be the case?
Well, I think it could be multifaceted. Like, Christians, they sent, speaking as a pastor's wife, Christians set up their leaders to be like these like idols up on pedestals that as long as they live pure, clean lives and, don't ever sin or crack a bad joke or say the F word, then all the world is good. Like my weak faith is strong enough kind of thing. And so I think that's why Christians partly do that, is that they just place all this faith in a leader, and in a way it's to absolve themselves of any action, right?
Yeah, and I mean, like, there's a Christian subculture, and within that world, like, it's just a whole different world. And it's funny. I think I don't think you really understand how weird it is until you step outside of it.
Totally.
You seem to know what I'm talking about. And like, I'm like, and I think there was a good time where, I was in the worship team, but I was also cynical at the same time. And so I'm like, I love playing the worship. I love Jesus. I love all these songs, but I'm just suspicious of like why we got lights and why we got to have this big sound system. And why am I up here on this stage? And then all those people are over there, right? And they're like kind of staring at me, Yeah. And getting outside of that now, it's like, it's almost like everybody's playing dress up. Like, it's like, what is this?
That is what it seems like. Like, because, and that's one thing that I've always been aware of, is that I didn't grow up a Christian. Like, I was very much a heathen growing up. And I came to faith when I was 21, I think. And then like just dove right into to Christianity, like just eating it all up, like as if I was a starving being. But I mean, my family are in this area, none of them are Christians. We're in an area that is very non-Christian. So I've always been aware of like, okay, this is like that. Let's not speak the Christian lingo here, because these guys don't understand. Like what? Yeah. Like why? Can we just be normal? You know? Yeah.
All right. So they believe America is God's country. And this is a crazy thing to watch as a Canadian, is that there's all these Christians in the United States who believe America is God's chosen country. And I know Canadians that are like, yes. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like,
Right.
why? How are you on board with this? Like, it's just weird. And any ideas why we have Canadians that are buying into this and are like totally like, all right, Jerusalem's, or Israel's no longer the chosen country. That mantle has now fallen on the United States, like not us.
Yeah.
And we're totally okay with that. Like, I'm
Well, okay, so a couple things. The thing about Canadians is, I mean, we're nice people, right? Like, we're not power hungry lunatics.
right.
I mean, I don't think we are. Like, we're
Yeah.
generally nice people. Like, yeah, if you complain about our poutine, we might get upset, but generally we're nice people. So
Yeah.
for us, like as a culture, we don't have this need to be domineering and the greatest. Like it's like we don't need to prove that, is maybe how to say that. We don't need to prove that to the world. We know we're great.
But even that makes it incredible that any Canadian could stomach Donald Trump, because he's the guy that, when we talk about like alpha males, and it's such a weird thing to me when I see like conservative, it's usually conservative women I see who are like, oh, you're nothing but a beta male. And it's like, what, you're only into alphas. Like, you only want to see guys. Because like, to me, what I think their version of the alpha is the guy that's so insecure that when he walks into the room, he needs everyone to look at him.
Yeah, right.
And I'm like, your alpha's pathetic. Like, to me, I think a healthy masculinity, if we want to divvy up between masculinity and femininity, I think that like a healthy masculinity is someone who's okay with looking like a beta and is okay with being the alpha if the situation calls for it.
Yeah.
But anyways, I don't know. It's weird. It's a bit of a mystery. All right. So protesters get what they deserve. I actually remember as a teenager thinking protesters were just a bunch of people who had nothing better to do and were just causing trouble. Now, see, I'm a British Columbian, right? And so like British Columbia is like full of like hippies, right?
Totally.
But Northern BC, I guess, is a little different because I was able to like kind of, I guess there's a bit of that oil culture.
Yeah.
And so we're just kind of like, well, why don't those guys have jobs? Have your views on protesters changed over time?
Okay, so yes and no. I come from protesting and ancestry. Like my ancestry is Doukhobor. I mean, that's like, you don't get much protesting than like through Doukhobors. They protested way back in Russia, and they wouldn't pick up arms. They're and then so my whole family is Russian in that way. And then in our area is full of draft dodgers. Draft dodging hippies. My father-in-law is a draft dodger.
Oh wow.
So the whole like ethos of protesting is very Kootenay. Like I'll never forget, actually, one time my hairdresser friend told me she was cutting someone's hair and the March for Jesus. It was remember the March for Jesus? It would happen. I don't know, springtime maybe, I can't remember, but like it happened here in our town.
Did they save Jesus with that march?
I don't know, but the person my friend was cutting the hair of laughed and said, "Oh, people will just protest anything now." Like they had no idea that this was a march to like proclaim Jesus. They thought that it was like protesting him. It was funny. But like, so in high school, I was in grade 9, I think, when the Iraq War happened, and there was lots of protesting around here. And as a teenager, I totally protested. Like I I didn't think that it was a just war. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, so protesting to me, I think is good. Like, I've never thought anything bad of it, other than, you know, when people start really like burning and breaking things. But even then, if you understand like what has driven them to become that way in their protest, right?
Yeah. And I
Like
guess maybe at some level I felt like it was insincere. I felt like it's just people causing shit. Right?
Oh, for sure.
We can mark this as explicit now. I went first this time. Oh.
Like how explicit to us.
I know I marked the last one as explicit just because you said asshole. So I'm like, whatever.
Okay. Well, I'll still try to behave.
But yeah, I don't know. Like, I think at some level, it was like this sense that they're just a bunch of kids that are trying to get attention. In fact, like, I think that was something I heard my parents say about every kid. It's like, oh, look, that kid dyed their hair. They're looking for attention. And so maybe I bought into some of that too. And I think like at some level, these keyboard warriors, that's what they are, right? And I'm learning, like, there's so many people whose brand is either to criticize or to complain about being criticized, right?
Right.
Like, oh, totally. I got attacked again. And it's like, okay. And then they get like 1,000 more followers by telling everyone they got attacked, right? And it's like the whole thing is just so silly. And it does at some level bother me that, you know, when a tragedy happens, everybody just has kind of like their pet project they like to promote. And so like, I think that a lot of issues are multifaceted. And if we're realistic, you know, every individual that goes and does a shooting, there's a combination of a bunch of factors. And people want to negate the ones they want to defend. It's like, oh, it can't be guns. I like guns. It's written in our law somewhere that we're supposed to have them. So can't be that, right? But like, I don't know. It's interesting because I'm just kind of like, well, can we do this? Like, can we actually look at the actual situation instead of trying to tie it into like everything that makes you tick politically? Like, and anyways, all right. Okay, so the other thing, I'm not sure why I wrote this down. It must have been from the book, but it said people are too sensitive. This is something I hear from conservatives all the time. This statement so much. And I think what was really telling is I made a post about this on Facebook. And my friend Christelle replied and said that was something my abuser said to me all the time. And I'm like, that's it. When we have Christians using the language of an abuser, there might be something wrong. Yes.
I mean, that's just the fact of saying, "Oh, people are too sensitive." That's you're just bypassing someone's experience. You're not taking the time to say, "Okay, well, why are they reacting that way?" Right? You're delegitimizing who they are.
Well, and I think most of the people they're saying are too sensitive are the people that are being empathetic toward the oppressed. And so they assume selfish motivation on behalf of the snowflake. When in reality, when I talk to my kids, you know, my teenagers, they would tell you the reason why they're upset is because they have a friend who's suicidal over this kind of issue, right? And it's like, oh, okay, well, maybe we could use whatever pronoun they want. Like, like, it's not that hard. Like,
and then,
by the way, my trick with this is I assume they until told otherwise.
That's a good one. Because sometimes, I never want to offend anybody, and I have to really study some people's profiles to figure out, like, I mean, I want to honor who you are, and so I need to figure out, like, what am I saying? You know, I think that's important.
I finally gave in and put my pronouns in my profile. I that was some deliberation because I was like thinking, oh, that's such a social justice thing to do. And it's like, it's all virtue signaling. It's like, oh, look how woke I am. I have my pronouns in my bio. But my kid explained to me several times, he's like, this is how you allow a person who's transgendered to feel comfortable putting their pronoun in the bio. If everybody's doing it, then it's not just them doing it, right? And so I was like,
that's right. That's right.
It was basically after the Twitter purge. I was like, you know what? I think it's safer to me to go to like full social justice warrior here. So I'm gonna do it.
And like, what's wrong with social justice warrior? I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
I'm still struggling to understand that. I have had people on the podcast that are against social justice, and I still find it perplexing. I think I'm actually going to be doing an episode on critical race theory down the road once I'm done reading the book. Because I really want to touch on that, because I think my idea so far is that I think if we categorize people too much, we don't allow, treating the individual as an individual, right? Because it's like, there is a black CEO with a white person that's a male boy, right? Or male person, and it's like, not every black person is worse off than a white person. However, comparatively speaking, a black CEO and a white CEO are going to have different experiences, right? And so I think that, like, if we systematically look at every person based on identity and say, this is the oppressed, this is the oppressor, at some point it's going to fail in real life. And so I'd want to be careful that I don't just look at categories, but I actually listen to people about their experience.
Right. Yeah.
So, but I still have to read the book, so I don't know. I got to find something I'm against in it. I want to try to be intellectually honest and not buy into some system. I'm just like that. So.
Yeah.
All right. So this is what really blew my mind initially in the book was this idea that it was Christian pop culture that shaped the theology of the church. Now, this makes so much sense. Christian pop culture tried to be interdenominational. I didn't have enough confidence that time. Denominational. There we go. Alpha male coming out.
There you go.
Which meant some compromise, but that would influence the way pastors would preach, because their congregations would have a certain point of view that they would have to cater to. So it was kind of fun to hear some of the pop culture references she cited. Joyce Meyer, Veggie Tales, Amy Grant, DC Talk, Newsboys. Did any of those Christian pop influences shape your theology as a young Christian?
Oh yeah, I mean, I listened to all those. That there's a good chunk of time where so music is super important to me. Yeah. Like super important to me. I'm like all over music all the time. Music, awesome. Yeah. There's a super good chunk of time that I did not engage in any secular music because I was so wrapped up in the Christian pop culture scene.
Me too.
And when I look back, man, it actually makes me mad because there was all this fear that if you go outside of the Christian realm, then your mind will be poisoned and your soul is poisoned or something.
Yeah.
And so they tried to have all these upbeat music and they just basically tried to copy the culture except Christianize it, right?
Yeah. And I had kind of this idea that Christians could produce superior art, and that would draw culture to Christianity, which is almost like prosperity doctrine, but like an artsy version of prosperity doctrine.
Yeah.
And that was so important to me in that moment. But I guess, I think we're going to get into it later, but I know there was stuff like Every Man's Battle and what's that Eldridge book?
Wild at Heart.
Wild at Heart, yes. which really influenced my view on gender. And that was something for sure I've deconstructed.
Yeah.
So anyways, not getting ahead of myself.
Yeah.
So it seems this started with Victorian Christianity being considered too feminine. They wanted to, I said masculine it up. That doesn't make sense. They wanted to dude it up
Yeah.
so they wouldn't lose men from the church. Now, that's interesting. I actually did an episode of the Wax Museum, and my friend Doug, who I learned so much from in the first few episodes of this podcast, because it used to be just me and him doing the podcast all the time. And we would never prep. Like, we would just like, he would hit me with a question, because Doug is like that. Like, he's a guy.
Wow. Okay.
He makes you uncomfortable by asking you questions. So we get on the podcast and he's like, so John, what do you think about feminism? And it's funny because, like, I think initially I was answering that question, but I had just recently listened to this podcast, Bad Christian Podcast, where they had a guy on there who was explaining why church is designed for women and children and how it doesn't draw men. And so basically I flipped this whole podcast that was supposed to be about feminism to complain about how church is not masculine for most men and we're losing men for that reason, which is amazing. So like I used to be exactly what caused us to get away from Victorian Christianity. So my views have shifted so much since then.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is like recognizing that the hyper masculinity is really the result of insecurity. And it's like, if you're secure in who you are, masculinity, femininity, like who cares? Like just rock whatever you are. Like who cares?
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you known men like that are like super
Yep.
Actually, I got ahead of myself on that one, but that's okay. So I mean, now that where they got when she actually delved into this, she started talking about Theodore Roosevelt, which is so interesting because like Theodore Roosevelt is like kind of known as a man's man, right?
Right. Yeah.
Which is also a funny term because it sounds very homosexual, and the people that say it are definitely not or don't want to be homosexual.
Maybe secretly they are.
Maybe secretly they are. Yeah. Man's man.
It sure seems like those who preach purity and chastity are always the ones who break it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's awful. So anyways, yeah. So Theodore Roosevelt initially was not a masculine man. He was a nerdy guy. He had a voice that people would not consider masculine. And he got a makeover. And then he became what he is, or what he was known for, the bear wrestling burly dude.
Right.
I guess he changed his voice somehow. But it's like I said, there's so much insecurity I see with these men who are image conscious enough that they're so careful in what they dress, how they dress, their mannerisms, what activities they participate in, out of fear that someone would call them effeminate.
Yeah.
So by the 1910s, men were seen as protectors, and I guess part of it was because of this prototype. Now, I had no idea this was such a recent development. I mean, at some level, I still do feel like I'm supposed to be the protector, but I don't go around telling every man that's what you got to be, right?
Right.
Where are you at with that kind of mentality?
Well, I mean, so the first thing is like this, like hyper masculinization thing, like views femininity as a bad thing.
Yeah.
So like, let's just start there. For one, like being a woman is not a bad thing. being feminine is not a bad thing. God is both masculine and feminine. Like, being feminine is not bad. So as far as like the protector idea, I mean, my husband's great. Like, he'll totally like protect if there needs to be protection. 100%. I'm gonna stand by his side. Like, I'm not gonna like stand behind him. I'm gonna stand by his side and protect with him. Like, I see us as a team. It's not that like this is your job to go and face whatever it is, the bear or whatever. Although legit, when the bears do come on the property, my husband does get the gun and go out and scare them. But
of course,
it's not. He doesn't need to be the protector. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, he's comfortable and confident in who he is. He doesn't need to prove anything to anybody. And these men that feel like they need to be buff, and like, there's nothing wrong with buff. There's nothing wrong with masculinity and wanting to be strong. Wanting to protect. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you say this is the only way to be masculine, this is the only way that matters, and to be feminine is bad, I mean, that's just bullshit. Totally. Like, come on. I mean, how many women warriors have, been in history, have been like kick-ass warriors? There's been lots.
And part of me wonders too, like, if we would have less people struggling with their gender identity if we stop stereotyping gender all the time. Like, it's like, no. It's like, maybe someone would be more comfortable with their anatomy if you didn't tell them, according to your anatomy, this is who you are. Like, if we could just let people be, I think we would have a much healthier society. So,
and the attraction of, I mean, there's all kinds of different men, and there's all kinds of different women. Now, me personally, I don't like the buff guys. I don't like the macho men. I mean, go stick your head in a hole. I don't like them at all. I like the geeks. I like the nerds. I think they're the sexiest people on the planet because they don't need to prove anything. They can just be who they are. You know what I'm saying? Like, so.
And personally, I really like smart women, and I like women that are trouble. I don't know why. It's just intriguing to me. I'm like, and I know that turns on me sometimes, but like, but it's like, I've just never really been attracted to the pushover person, or, like, it's, I mean, I want to protect the pushover person. I want to help the pushover person not be a pushover, but as far as like just building relationships with people, I wouldn't trust the pushover person. Right? Like, it's like, it's just, you're not healthy. You can't handle my stuff. All right. So World War I, there was a backlash against draft dodgers, which is interesting. I listened to, I was going to mention this when you said there was a draft dodger in your husband's family, right? I recently listened to a podcast episode with Tim O'Brien, who's a Vietnam vet and an author. And he essentially said that he went to war out of cowardice. He was afraid of what his hometown would think of him being a draft dodger. I would think there were a whole lot of people back then. So I almost, like, from this guy's argument, it's like that relative who was a draft dodger, it's like that took some serious chutzpah.
It took a ton of courage, because so, like, he's from New York. This is my father-in-law, and objected out of conscience. And I can't quite remember the story, right? But I remember that he had left or went into hiding or something, and his dad got sick, and so he came back, and like the authorities were looking for him because he was a well-known draft dodger. And then eventually, he makes his way across the country, meets my mother-in-law who's now passed away, and then they come up to Canada and like full-on hippies, squatters for a time, even like, but that took a ton of courage.
Yeah.
It took a ton of courage to go against the grain when everybody was going off to war.
Yeah.
And there was lots of hiding. There was like a ton of hiding, and it was not safe for them. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like what looks like weakness is actually strength. And often
In a lot of ways.
looks like strength is often weakness. I think that's kind of the theme of this podcast episode. Yeah. And I mean, the whole topic of war is such a difficult one because I don't like taking for granted people who have risked their lives for my freedom.
For sure.
But I think like when people say freedom is bought at a price, they tend to always think in terms of their own soldiers. Freedom is paid at a price of our good guys. And that's assuming our guys are the good guys. When in reality, freedom is bought at the price of our soldiers, the enemy soldiers, the family of our soldiers who may lose that loved one, or that loved one comes back with PTSD and they're not even recognizable. The civilians that get caught in the crossfire. I mean, it's just freedom's bought at a price, but it's like it's multifaceted.
Yeah, everybody at the time pays.
Yeah, and it's generations pay, right? And it's like it's so awful, and it's really hard to be okay with any form of war, while at the same time acknowledging that the privilege we have came at some level with that kind of conflict, right? It's like, why are we even here? It's like, well, we forced the indigenous people to give us their land. And so anyways. All right. So Billy Graham.
Yeah. So before we start, my grandma used to say, she's like, now she's 86, I think. Yeah, 86. She was a Christian Scientist. So she was all about the mind. And she always used to say about Billy Graham, he used to be all fire and brimstone and he was real mean. And I'm sure glad he's mellowed out now.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because I haven't heard anybody talk about Billy Graham that goes back that far, right? I know, like, you know, my parents always seen, you know, they're like, I don't understand why Franklin Graham's so political. Billy Graham was never political. And it's like, actually,
but
and I mean, it was one of those things, I think, like when we see like a Christian hero of the faith pass away, I'm always kind of like, okay, hold on, before we just all assume, you know, like all the best things about that person or everything like that. I just think we need to be careful because stuff may come out, like they may get Ravied, you know, like, I mean, look at Ravi. That's insanity. And it's still appalling to me that guy went to his deathbed not dealing with that, not giving his victims justice and not getting himself right. Like that's But anyways, Billy wasn't that bad. But so he certainly played into this pro-military patriarchal ethos. He used sports and war metaphors. He started a Christian soldier organization to fight against drunkenness, gambling, and venereal disease. I remember I used to have this high amount of reverence for what soldiers have done historically to fight for our freedom. And now, as I explained, it's like, it's actually broader than that. Like fighting for our freedom means there's a whole lot of collateral damage. Even the term collateral damage, I feel like falls short of explaining there are lives that are lost that are uninvolved.
Yeah, totally.
So Graham's revivalist movement benefited from the Cold War and the threat of the nuclear holocaust. The fear of this sent people running to his arms. He preached gender roles. he got Eisenhower into power and added under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, and in God we trust to the money. So this seems like it's really the birth of Christian nationalism. It's like Billy Graham was the father or grandfather of Christian nationalism. It's crazy
like it seems to it kind of like started slow and little, and then grew, and then just in the last like 4 or 5 years exploded.
Yeah, so it kind of creeped in. But it's kind of interesting because there was a lot of like anti-communism kind of propaganda.
Yep. Well, I mean, in order to build up your cause, you have to find an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they did with socialism and communism. That was the enemy. Like, and for sure, probably for the communists and socialists too. Like, they do the same thing to prop up their system and say about North Americans, like the, dirty North Americans or whatever. Like, it's all just to bolster your own system and say we're better, right?
Well, and like I said, it's like anytime we see a tragedy, that's what everyone's doing on social media. It's like my system's better, right? It's like and it's like reality is so much more complex. And like I also like when we did the socialism episode I did with the new transcendentalist, he talked about like the Hay River or Hay riots, if I'm getting this right. Confidence, Hay riots, that's what it's called. No. But he talked about how like there was this guy who started a tractor company, and he created, I think it was a thresher. My backs are probably all whack on this, but the point remains. And he created this piece of farm equipment, and it was totally magic, and everybody wanted to buy it. And he and his workers were benefiting from that. And his son went away to college, came back from college with this business degree, and he's like, you know what? We can pay the workers less. And so he started kind of shifting things. And there were workers that were like, hey, like we've really increased our productivity now using this machine. So do you think maybe we could just like, instead of working 10 hours, only work 8 hours a day?
Right.
And the son says, well, why do you only want to work 8 hours a day? Is that so that you can go home and drink? Because you shouldn't be drinking. That's not the Christian thing to do. Well, and so he said, you know what? I'm going to fire some of you so that you have to work 10-hour days. So he did that, and they protested. And when they protested, it got rowdy and it became a riot. And so they jailed, I think it was 4 or 5 of these people, saying, these are the people that caused the riot. They ended up staying in jail for quite a long time. They ended up replacing, I believe, those workers. And when they replaced those workers, they basically said, they had like a church meeting, and they kind of said, hey, here's the thing. You guys want to prosper. If you want to do well, do what this guy says. He's your boss. Do what this guy says. And don't drink. Don't, and there were all these things, and it kind of formed this kind of Protestant work ethic. That whole mentality came from this.
Wow.
And that's part of why there's such an anti-socialist movement, because it's like, no, you listen to the boss. The boss knows what he's talking about. He's the one that's giving you all this wealth. And so it's just like really pushing a hierarchical structure. And the other thing that, Taylor from New Transcendentalist explained was like just how throughout history, the American government has done everything they can to undermine socialism. And that included putting like sanctions on Venezuela. And now every time you talk to like a conservative about socialism, they're like, well, look at Venezuela. Look at how big of a mess that is. And it's like, yeah, you guys played a role in making it a mess on purpose.
Right. I mean, hey, Canada, socialism, come on. I mean,
we have socialized medicine
there.
That is That is something like that's blowing my mind. I'm watching Shameless. I can't stop watching Shameless. It's so depressing. I love it. And every time someone gets hurt, they have to go to the hospital. I'm like, oh, well, that sucks. I guess they're not going to be at work for a bit. And then I realize, oh yeah, that's 120 grand out of their pocket. Like, I'm like, I cannot imagine. Every time you get hurt, you're like that's never a thought on my mind. If I get hurt, or I get sick, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to miss work. That might suck. But I don't have to think about this big medical bill.
I always say, like, on Twitter, something like when I'm proud to be Canadian, or someone's like bitching about that I'm Canadian or socialism, or I always say, oh, well, I think tomorrow I'm going to go get my feelings checked for free just to make sure I'm okay.
That's right.
Like, yeah, the whole idea that your family could be in ruins because you had to go to the doctor. That's ridiculous. Like, it's actually ridiculous.
It is. All right. So I think we'll cover one more topic here.
Okay.
This is almost like ADD Masterminds. ADD Masterminds, we always do like a whole bunch of like different topics, and it's like 5 minutes of each topic.
Oh,
and
wow.
It's a weird show, but it's fun to do. Hopefully it's fun to listen to. But it's like just with this book, there's so much to cover that it's almost like I have my list of topics and hopefully they fit together. But I'm like, oh, but this is a book, so I don't have to worry about it fitting together. All right. So it was really interesting to think about war movies and Westerns of the 50s and 60s. And how basically she says that so much of the heroism was a white man fighting against a non-white man.
Yeah.
I saw a lot of movies like this as a kid. Did you watch those growing up at all?
And not tons, but yeah, definitely some. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's funny, yeah, because I just never thought of them in those terms. But a lot of it is kind of like, that's the foreigner, you can't trust them. And it's not really like stated because of the color of their skin. Because I mean, certainly there's some anti-German sentiment. But man, when you talk about like the Japanese, you talk about indigenous people, like all of the, like they're not treated well because they're evil, right? And it's like, it's so screwed up. And I think when we talk about white supremacy, that's what it is. It's like, no, our culture is superior, so you guys need to assimilate.
Right. Yep.
And that's been the story. And I think that's the fundamental difference in how the left and the right see race, is that the left sees this system of like Eurocentric, this is the best way, we will not consider things outside of this way, as white supremacy. Whereas on the conservative end, it's like, look, I don't think that my skin makes me better than other people. And it's like, okay, good. You've made progress. So you're kind of like a 90s non-racist. You know what I'm saying? Like, I remember in the 90s, it was like, that was the thing. It's like, I don't see color. It's like, oh, you're not racist. Congratulations. But it's like, you know what? I've learned things since the 90s. And I feel like there's a section of our population that has not learned things since the 90s.
Yeah, but even the statement, I don't see color, is that not a racist statement in itself? Like, you're saying that because, okay, I hope I'm not going to say this badly, but like, by not seeing color, then you're dismissing their whole story.
Absolutely.
You're dismissing their whole story. So now you're saying your story doesn't even fucking matter. I'm sorry. Your story doesn't even matter.
Yeah.
Like, and that actually makes me angry.
Yeah.
It actually, because these people think that, oh, I'm not racist, I'm being so good, I don't see color. And it's like, actually, you're bypassing the entire thing and setting yourself up once again. Oh yeah, you've set yourself up to be still like on the top rung, like still saying you're the best, still saying like there's nothing wrong with you. When the statement, I don't see color, is everything wrong with you.
Well, my own experience with this is like, for me, it's like I had friends that were indigenous. I had a friend who was indigenous, had a friend who was like um was, like, just, I guess I had friends of all different kinds.
Yeah.
People of color who were friends, in my life. And in particular, I think about my friend who's Métis. And I remember when the Canucks changed their logo to like an indigenous logo, my friend is like, "Oh, that's cool. That represents my heritage." And I look at him like, "That's part of your heritage?" Like, I didn't really understand. But I asked him no further questions. And
Yeah.
then years later, 20, more than 20 years later, I, made a post about residential schools. And my friend says, "Yeah, my dad went to one of those." And I'm like,
Yeah.
"What? Like, how did I
Yeah.
not know this?" And like,
Yeah.
how was that not part of his story that I would hear about him? Because I
Yeah.
think in modern times, my kids would know that about their friends because
Yeah.
that's part of the conversation. But back
Yeah.
then, that wasn't part of the conversation because the best thing I could do for my friend was, and I never really believed in not seeing color,
Mhm.
but I believed in not treating people different because of their color, which I believed
Right.
was not racist.
Right.
But the problem is I missed out on their story because part of their
Yeah.
story is that they lived a different experience than me. And there's
Yeah.
something very rich there that
Yeah.
could have, you know, given them the opportunity to tell their story
Yeah.
and would have given me the opportunity to better understand, you know,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
what I've been given, and
Yep.
there's just a lot there. Like, I just think
Yeah.
diversity is such an incredible thing. And not only do, people, of color miss out when we ignore, you know, what has held them back, if that's the case for them. I think we also miss out on great things we can learn from their culture.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
it's like being able to kind of take off your supremacy hat.
Yeah.
And it's like, and I think again, it's like the white supremacy is not me saying because of my skin color I'm superior. It's more like, this is our culture. We all swim in it. And it's like
Yeah.
everybody just needs to get on board because this is our culture. And it's like, well,
Right.
that's Eurocentric.
Yeah.
And I think, within Christianity, that's been an interesting thing for me because I've become more and more uncomfortable with this whole like, well, let's do apologetics. Let's use the right words to convince someone to believe what we believe. When I'm
Right.
like, well, in reality, I firmly believe that God is love. And so
Yeah.
I want to lead people to love.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to worry about them saying the right magic words. I want to lead
Yeah.
people to love.
Yeah. And I
And
mean,
if
just
mhm,
because we were born and raised
mhm,
here in this
mhm,
culture, in under this kind of privilege,
yeah,
and in a Christian culture, you know, um, and then we think that like someone raised in a Muslim culture, like how unfortunate for them. Well,
mm.
who are we to think that? Like, you know what I mean? Like this, the whole like apologetics and trying to convince somebody and um
And I mean, and I
to
want to know,
change
like,
people.
I want to know how Islam really plays out in that
Hmm.
person's life.
Yeah.
I don't need somebody lecturing me on what I should believe about Islam. I want to
Yep.
actually know my Muslim neighbor and break bread with them and figure out
Hmm.
if their God really is that different from mine. Because I
Right.
think
And I
like
yeah.
because I think that like, my understanding of God is like it's a beautiful thing. And I like if it can become more beautiful by sharing with someone with a different perspective, awesome.
Hmm.
But if my version of God is more beautiful and I could share it with them, that's awesome too. Like let's help each other, right? And
Hmm.
it's the more walls we put in, the less possibility there is of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think we will end this part here.
Okay.
Next time we will be talking about some televangelists.
Ooh.
Jim Baker and Jimmy Swaggart. And that'll be into April, I think, because I've got a episode I am doing with Mitchell and Tancio.
Cool.
We're going to be talking about Christian music. I'm not sure what exactly yet. I'll have to put together notes for that one. But yes, so I'm looking forward to that. I'll also have a guest. I'm going to have a band on my podcast. My son's the lead singer, Tirefall.
Cool.
And so they just finished recording their debut album, and it's so much fun. I'm so excited. I've been listening. I listened to it today. I've had the songs in my head all day. So I'm excited about that. And they got a bit of a following, so maybe I'll get the Tirefall bump. We'll see.
Are they on Google Play? Like,
they are on everything. Yeah.
Okay. Send me their name again.
I will.
Yeah.
I absolutely
I always
will.
love new music. Awesome.
Good. Well, thank you. And follow Mystic Pirate Kootenaygirl.
My name's Marie, but it's Mystic Pirate Kootenaygirl on Twitter.
Okay. What's your handle? Your handle is Mystic Pirate Kootenaygirl?
Yeah. That's my handle.
Sweet. Yeah. All right. We will do this again soon.
Thanks,
and we'll get through this entire book. So much to share.
Such a good book. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to The Wax Museum. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to keep you updated on everything Wax Museum. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or like us on Facebook. It's at Wax Museum Pod.
Air smudge.